Stanislaw, the in-game leader and support player of OpTic Gaming, has left and joined rival in the NA scene, Team Liquid. Now, first and foremost, this is massively shocking because OpTic as a team was steadily on the rise in 2016 and over the last few months had a fantastic run that saw them winning E-League, an enormous event, beating out the team that now is the best in the world, Astralis, in the final. They managed to get to the final of ECS Season 2 where they lost to Astralis, who admittedly is the better team. At the major, 2 of their 3 losses that eliminated them in the Swiss system were to the teams that went to the final of the tournament. So this is a team where I think a lot of people still thought they had potential, still thought they could accomplish great things. Personally, I wasn't really one of those people, but even I wanted to see how it would play out. I wanted to see, was I right? Would things go the way they seemed? Would they have any more big placings? I wanted to really see what they were capable of given, say, 3 or 4 big LAN tournaments. So I do think that the OpTic lineup was a bit overrated. I mean, they reminded me of G2 a little bit in terms of needing such big performances from their superstars that's what really won them the big games of their careers. And when they didn't get those, they were just a top 10 team hovering around the middle to the slightly lower parts. We're talking like 5th to 7th in the world, that sort of a rating. Now, admittedly, they had a lot of depth in their team. That was the big upside that their team had. So as a result, their biggest ever result came without their stars, Mixwell and Tarek, playing very well, which is when NAF went crazy. Now, their big upside was that they had this massive amount of versatility. So first of all, they had 3 AWPers potentially. I mean, in reality, only Mixwell really should be a dedicated AWPer, in my opinion. He thinks of himself as a hybrid, but I think he's the only one who really could do it on a dedicated scale. Tarek and NAF are very much hybrid players, and I actually think NAF only really when he was really, really hot should ever have had the AWP, but they certainly had 3 players who could AWP, and therefore across many different maps, and depending on the form of each player at any given time, they could change up what they were doing, which is big. Not a lot of NA teams could do that. They had a dedicated entry player in Rush, who, much like an Apex, had absolutely committed himself to the role, and because he understood his in-game leader and played with him for quite a while, really knew how to work off what that guy needed, and therefore he really created space for the star players like Tarek, like Mixwell, to have an impact on the game. And then they had what I always thought of as quite an intelligent support in-game leader in Stanislaw. I've always been impressed with how he played. Didn't necessarily know he'd be that good as an in-game leader because he only took over when Daps was kicked, but he's only impressed me more in that sense. I thought he was a very valuable player. Now, I do think one of the things that made them overrated, in my opinion, was, first of all, I don't think they were quite good enough in terms of their star players to make them a top 4 team going forwards. Like, they had some great runs in the past, all credit to them, take your hat off to them, but Mixwell and Tarek were never going to be able, as a duo, to live up to, I mean, pick out your other duos, Cold and Fallen. I mean, look at who we've got at the moment. I mean, Astralis has got a wealth of talent, so you don't even need to go there. Like, it was always going to be hard for them to live up to the level of any other team's top 2 star players. So the depth was good and could make up for that, but I didn't see it in the long run being consistent enough, especially in this era where all these teams are upgrading and now it's getting real scary at the top. I also think if you go and look at their biggest tournament runs, they got the easier side of the bracket. This is not really even debatable. I mean, you go and you look, okay, let's go to even a smaller tournament. Go to that Northern Arena. I think it was, would it be Montreal or Toronto? I think Toronto was the second one, was it? The one that they beat G2 in the final. They arguably got the easier semi-final because Heroic got an upset in the group, and so they got to play Heroic despite being a second place finishing team in their side of the bracket and get to the final. Then you go to E-League, they easily got the easier side of the bracket there. They even in some senses got some favours done to them arguably by Astralis being the team to get out the other side, because it wasn't SK that they had to play with full force. It wasn't NIP that they had to play. You know, this was an easier run. And then ECS, they got the easier run again thanks to Envious doing some weird upset in the group stage over SK, but then shitting the bed kind of. So they did a great job with what they were given. With the hand they were dealt, they did pretty much the best you could expect of them, but I didn't see them doing a lot and having massive results. And I also think at the major, people have been unfair in how they characterize that. Yes, when you look back now, you have to look at it and say, from the beginning of the tournament, their first 2 games were against the 2 favourites, and at the end of the tournament, their first 2 games were against the 2 finalists. Yeah, that really sucks, but let's not forget, that's not the fault of E-League or even the seeding in theory. Now, the seeding should have never been OpTic against VP in the first match. That one shall give you. But that's the only game that really is unfair in that sense. You go to the second game against Astralis. Why were they playing Astralis? Because Astralis had lost to Godsend. Now, even so, I probably would not have seeded it so that Astralis and and OpTic could play, but then again, you don't use seeding for the second round. So it's random. So actually, that was a randomizer that picked that. They could have picked out a bunch of the teams that lost the first game. They could have got Hellraisers there. That could have happened. So I admit it could have gone easier in that sense, but it's only really the first game you can blame in that sense. So they lost to VP and Astras. Okay, those are fine. I can accept those losses. They were close. They had their chances. But let's not then forget the next two maps and rewrite history and conveniently ignore the facts. So yes, they did great and they might have won certainly the game against VP. And I think they had chances against Astras, but Astras was just a better team all around. But then you go to the next two games. They played Flipside and then they played Godsent. So first of all, Flipside, if you're going to say that OpTic could have beaten Virtus Pro, you must say that Flipside could have beaten OpTic here. Flipside was in great position. They did a fantastic job. OpTic overcame them, played really well, but that was real tough to say who played better in that game. So they could have gone out 0-3 right then. Then they played Godsent. Now, that's the same Godsent that beat Astralis. But Godsent isn't that good a team. So in my opinion, Godsent's no way a top 5 team in the world. So OpTic should have been able to beat Godsent. They weren't able to. And part of that was the hubris of letting it go to cash. Thinking, well, we're really good on cash. No, you beat G2 on cash, mate. That's it. Like, I don't know where they got this idea that they were gods on cash. Their best maps are Train and Overpass. So I think they should have gone into those, despite the fact that those are strong Godsent maps, and said, we're better. Let's play all strong maps. I think they kind of suckered themselves in that respect. And so losing to Godsent, yeah, that's unacceptable. So I think it's not that ridiculous that they went out in the Swiss system when you consider the last two games they played and the fact they could have lost both of those as well. I mean, how much luck do you want? Put it that way, right? It's only a reasonable amount going around unless you're a godlike team where you make your own luck to some degree. So I actually think when you look at it, that Stanislaw leaving is not totally ridiculous if he saw some of the things I saw. And if he saw that the major qualifier, the major Swiss system rather, was indicative of OpTic not being quite as good as maybe their results suggested. With that said, it's still kind of crazy. If I were him, I probably would have played it out a bit. But Team Liquid, remember what I told everyone before this tournament? I told you this will be the last big tournament, the major, that Team Liquid 5-man lineup plays. And by the way, even Team Liquid players messaged me after that, what do you mean? What have you heard? And I said, no, you don't understand. It's not about, I know that a move's coming. It's that I've looked at the lay of the land. I've looked at what Team Liquid's done. I've looked how many times they've given that lineup a chance. And I've looked at what's likely to happen, which by the way was that they wouldn't get out of the group, the Swiss system. And I was just almost certain, knowing the Team Liquid players and the Team Liquid history, that they would not survive beyond that. And there would be some kind of a roster move. Whether that was a star player going, an in-game leader coming in, swapping out one of the older players, who knew? Something was coming, and it has. So for Team Liquid, I think signing Stanislaw, which is interesting that everyone calls him Stanislaw, because actually that name, if you go to Eastern Europe, is pronounced Stanislav, but whatever, is probably one of the best signings they could do at this point in time. Because I actually think if you look at the in-game leaders in NA right now, he's the best you can get. Stewie 2K, I've always said he's like a mini Shox, and because he's only a mini Shox, he's not Shox. He's never going to be the best anyway, because Shox isn't the best in-game leader, but he plays around his own style, and we still don't know how other players will fit into playing with him. He hasn't been able to get the best out of all his players, so he's good, but to a limit. Sean Gers is still dining out on some reputation from a year and a half ago or more, despite the fact that Echo Fox was utter fucking garbage on both sides of the map. And that was a team he chose, he helped put together, and he picked some of those players, and he even chose to stick with some of those players afterwards. So I don't have a whole lot of sympathy. I do have a little bit, in as much as I never thought they could succeed. I thought that org was kind of garbage, but I think Sean Gers has not lived up to that rep that he had basically for 1 year of his career. Everyone forgets in 2014 he wasn't some mega mastermind. He was a good player, did what he could, and in NA he certainly was playing a more smart tactical style. He wasn't some god of in-game leading. So people have gone too far on the Sean Gers hype train. So for me, Stanislaw was the obvious best pickup. Now, I didn't think he would be available. I did not think they'd be able to get him because of all the bonuses of him being an OpTic. And I also thought, if anything, if you're him, you stay in OpTic and try and swap a player out. Like if I'm him, what I would probably do in OpTic is either fuck it, let's swap out, Fixel wants to go home to Swain, if that's a possibility, it certainly was a rumour, then fuck it, we bring in Liege. Or you know what, we bring in some player instead of Naf, who's going to play a smarter style, a more supportive style. These are the moves I would have done to upgrade OpTic, but whatever, Stanislaw decided for whatever reason to go over to Team Liquid. So I think it's a great signing for Team Liquid. Now, there are some issues though, because it's only a great signing on paper. Now, one of the issues I could see being a problem here is whether or not Stanislaw, who, if you see how he's been in his other teams, where he's been kicked and he's been one of the more quiet players at times, I want to know, does he have the authority? Does he have the voice to tell the Team Liquid players what they're going to do and how they're going to play, and to keep them to task, as it were? and it not just be timeouts from Zeus where he's screaming at them. Stanislaw's got to be a more authoritative figure, in my opinion, to make the Team Liquid players work. Because Team Liquid is a classic example of a team where almost every player in this team, with the exception of probably Pimp, doesn't seem to know how they want to play, but either is too aggressive in saying they want to play a style that won't work for them, or is too quiet and won't demand what they need. So he needs to come in and really lay down the law, in my opinion. Now, I don't know if he's going to do that. He seems to have been more of a quiet player in some of his past teams. So it'll probably depend if early on they buy into a system early on and then he has success. If he has success, that can get over the fact that he might not be this authoritative figure. I also think if you look at this team, when you've got Nitro and Elige, these are pretty difficult players to deal with. These are players who are going to have their own mind and they can be stubborn and they want to play their way. And if you don't let them play their way, they just tend to kind of climb up a bit, and they just they're reminding me of that kid where the mom wants the kid to go out, and so the kid doesn't want to go, and so when they pretend like they can't move and they're just like a dead body, and the mothers have to just drag them along. It's almost like that type scenario. So certainly those are two fantastic players, or the potential right now to both be fantastic players, but they're very difficult to deal with. So if Stanislaw's going to implement his system, he's probably going to have to take into account a lot of what they like. You might not necessarily be able to tell them what they're going to do because they probably won't do that. Now, I do think having Pimp is a big bonus. I'm really glad Team Liquid kept hold of Pimp, because you have to understand, Pimp came in and literally did every shit role other people didn't want to do in the team. There's so many other big egos and people who have to have their spot and their role that Pimp just did every other. And so when you look at that, in the context of that, I think he performed well and he did a good job, actually. So I'm glad they've got someone like that in the team, because that's always been one of the problems in the past of this team, is that they always had someone who sucked at doing stuff like that, like a Dren. So at least Pimp has talent. So I think he's a big bonus to help someone like Stanislaw and work with him to accomplish better things and set a base for how the team's going to play. I also think it's a positive that Stanislaw has played with AWPers before and has worked with a number of them. So I hope he understands how to set JDM up to be his dedicated AWPer. Because at the moment, if you don't set JDM up to be a dedicated AWPer, it feels like a waste of time right now. And so at the moment, he's going to waste completely. He's an average to below average NA pro. I think that they really need to figure out the entry situation. Because for me, this team was always at its best, this core, when they had Elige and Nitro playing an entry duo that played off each other. Well, with Elige's level right now and how good he is, I'd just have Nitro as the dedicated entry and have Elige as the follow-up. I think that would be fantastically successful and also clears room then for the AWPer to come in and be supported by the other two players and get his shots as well. I think this kind of a setup balance on paper works. Whether you can implement it is a massively different question, obviously. I do think that since we're essentially plugging Stanislaw instead of Hiko, I think he can be better than Hiko in both aspects of the role. Playing that style, he's a very intelligent guy. He's also quite good at lurking and going around and doing flanks and stuff. His timing's pretty good. And as in-game leader, he's obviously going to be better than Hiko, because Hiko ideally wouldn't have wanted to be an in-game leader. He just had to be to try and make that team work. I think the potential is big for this team. I think the potential for Team Liquid is bigger than the potential that OpTic had. It's just that initially they're worse than OpTic. Like on paper right now, they haven't been able to show that potential, and at the moment they're obviously at a lower level starting out than OpTic were at their peak. So the big question to me, there's two key questions about this team, and the two key questions are just Nitro and JDM, because Elige is a star player. He gets his kills. He's starting to learn how to get his kills, where to get his kills, and that's why he's being very consistent with his performance, and now he knows what he's going to do as his role. Pimp's just going to do your supportive roles as you want them anyway. And Stanislaw's going to be the in-game leader, play this more supportive lurk style. So the other two, Nitro and JDM, are the two question marks. Because for me, the latter, JDM, has to be a star player. He has to be the primary AWP and have things set up around him. Because he's not like hybrid players where they can go to a rifle and still be effective. If this guy doesn't get his AWP rolling, and when he gets his AWP rolling, he can be very good. If he doesn't get his AWP rolling, he's pretty crap. I've said this in past videos. I'll link one up here if I remember, which was about the fact that he essentially, for such a good AWPer, has no rifle game whatsoever. And that's why for so long he was playing with 5-7, FAMAS. That's the problem. So he has to be the star player. And then the former, so Nitro, he doesn't necessarily have to be a star player because you've got Elige and you're going to have JDM then. But what he has to be is effective and consistent in his role. That's the key thing. Effective and consistent in his role. It's not about killing. It's not about frags. It's not about being a star player. If he can play a role, ideally, I think the entry frag role personally, if he can play that and be effective and do it consistently, he will open up the game for those stars. And those are two stars that are good enough in NA to make you a top team in the world. And therefore, I think there is a big chance for Stanislaw in this team, if he can get all these moving parts in place and fix all the little possible issues. I do think there's a chance for him to show himself to be a truly great in-game leader and to actually have a team that can be like top 5 in the world, top 6 in the world. Sure, it's a very, very tough environment right now. There's a lot of great teams being formed and putting stuff together that have potential right now. But I think this team can certainly be a top 10 team. I think they can be better. I think the pieces are there. The pieces always were there. They just didn't have the in-game leader to unlock them, and people weren't playing the right roles. The pieces are here for this to be a much better team than it's been in last iterations. Now, in terms of OpTic, they're a mess, unfortunately, because they have a lot of good pieces, but they don't have the in-game leader anymore. And Stanislaw, I thought his style, like the tempo of how he did that lurk, was a big part of what made them so effective. So for me, I think there's the rumor they might get Hiko because they're going to use him as stand-in initially. I think that's not a bad shout. He's a more clutch player. He's someone who can, in theory, if he goes back to his old lurk style, provide some pressure in that sense. Obviously, the in-game leader issues are massive. I mean, at this point, if I were them, I might even consider getting Daps back. I've always thought Daps knows how to run a team. The problem then becomes who to cut, right? Because the obvious person to cut would be Hiko, right? But then Hiko, in theory, might be one of your more consistent players if you put him in the right role. I personally, say what you want, I would personally cut Naf because I think you have to go all in on Tarek and Mixwell as your stars, even though I actually have to say I don't think that at the moment they've shown they can do it. Oh, sure, Mixwell's young in his career. Tarek's good, certainly has a good level, but I think it's hard to ride those two. But then again, if you set up the team differently, also maybe they could perform differently and respond differently in a different setup. So you got to go all in on your stars because then you know if it doesn't work, whether you have to change your stars, whether you have to change your supports. That's why I'm always in favour of having a style and playing right into that style, not just being a mishmash of everyone else's style and some second best carbon copy rubbish version. I mean, carbon copy doesn't make sense, it could be the exact same, but you know what I mean, like some wannabe of a better team and therefore not really knowing your own identity. I do still think OpTic has talent. They certainly could still end up being the best NA team. They've got the talent there to do it, but it's going to be a big if with no idea about what they're doing as the in-game leader. There's a lot of question marks there. So for all the talent they have and the versatility and the depth, how are they going to have that fantastic T-side on a train? How are they going to counter people when they play them on overpass? There's a lot of questions with this team. And so right now, that's the lay of the land.